Welcome, friends. It is week 5 in our study of Hosea, and I'm so glad you're here. And if you've been with us every week, you know where we are. But if you got lost, let me catch you back up. So far, Hosea has been challenging God's people who have fallen away from the ways of God, and he's calling them back to it. And so far, Hosea has done that in 2 big metaphors. Chapters 1 through 3, Hosea used the metaphor of his own marriage to call them to faithfulness and to remind them that God is pursuing a faithful covenant with God's people. And now we're in the middle of a long section, chapters 4 through 10, where Hosea is now, all of his preaching uses the metaphor of a trial. And God is the judge, and God's people are under indictment, and there have been threats of sentences and offers of reprieve, and the trial has gone back and forth, and we'll sort of conclude the trial today, although that metaphor will pop up later in the text as well. 8 through 10 is kind of the end of the trial. My name's Ethan. I'm here with my dad, Lee Magnus, and as happens in all of these trial sections, Hosea starts by reminding us of the indictment. And that's kind of, as a prophet, a big part of his ministry is to let people know, hey, folks, here's what you're doing wrong.
Yeah.
So what are these charges?
Yeah, he's acting like the prosecutor,
right?
Kind of in place of God. He's speaking for God. In a sense, God is the prosecutor,
right?
Because a little later on, we're going to be reminded of the language, the Lord has an indictment against Israel. But here, Hosea is bringing the charges. And as we begin chapter 8, he doesn't mess around. He just lays out the charges right away. The first ones, I think, are kind of in the category of ethical charges. They have to do with Israel's disobedience to the will of God, their moral wickedness. So, for instance, in verse 1, it says Israel has broken its covenant with God and transgressed God's law.
Yeah.
So there we get the two very most basic things of all, the relationship and the requirement of righteousness, which God expected of his covenant people. They've rejected the relationship, that's breaking the covenant, and they have been disobedient to God's law, and that is unrighteous.
Yeah.
So they, in a sense, the problem is they've been trusting to their own moral sense, their own ethical standards, and thinking that's good enough if they think they're good enough. And the problem is they haven't been trusting in God and God's will.
Yeah. And I love there's this little appeal here where they say, God, we know you, in verse 2. But immediately Hosea says, yes, but you have rejected what is good. You have not done what is good. It reminds me some stuff from Jesus about people who say, we know you. And he says, yeah, but you don't obey me. All right, what are some of these other charges? We said it starts out with these macro ethical charges. What are some, everything is under indictment here. What else is on the list?
Yeah, when we get to verse 4, he turns political. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, that is rulers, but without my knowledge. In other words, they're putting their trust in their own political systems that they have figured out. And, right from the beginning, God told prophets who should be the king.
Yeah.
But the northern kingdom of Israel,
they had no time for that.
They're not interested in God's will when it comes to choosing a king. They want somebody who's militarily powerful and politically influential.
Yeah.
And so God and Hosea condemn them on that because, once again, they're not putting their trust in God.
All right. So there's some local political indictment. We've got ethical indictment. What else is on our list?
Yeah, starting in the latter part of verse 4, he turns to religious, or we might call it spiritual problems. And we know the religious problem that the northern kingdom people were most subject to, and that is idolatry.
Yeah.
That is worshiping other gods of neighboring tribes.
Yeah. And in past weeks, we've talked about, in particular, the temptation to worship Baal and the associated gods relating to Baal and this kind of fertility cult and how tempting that was for an agricultural people to say, oh, if we worship your God, we'll have good crops, we'll have good rain. That's going to become relevant here in a minute. So yeah, setting up idols. This is this temptation to be drawn away from appropriate worship, including setting up idols about God. Verse 5, throw out your calf idol, which was a way of probably worshiping God, but a way that was influenced by the pagan culture around them. Yeah.
Yeah. The way, the symbol for Baal was a bull calf.
Yeah.
And the first king who set up the northern kingdom when it split off from the southern was to put a calf idol in Bethel and say, this is a place where you can worship God, our God, the God of Israel. You don't have to go to Jerusalem. Look, you can do it right here. And of course, in their minds, they're thinking, oh yeah, I guess the great high priest Aaron had a calf. God. So at any rate, it became a slippery slope from the worship of God to the idolatrous worship of God to the idolatrous worship of Baal.
Of other gods. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. Okay. So religious indictment. What's next on our list?
International politics. We talked about internal politics, right? But internationally, when it comes to verse 7, it says they're yielding to foreigners, and the foreigners are going to devour them. In verse 9, they've gone up to Assyria. Ephraim has bargained for lovers. And that reference to lovers is not a reference to sexual sin.
Right.
Adultery. That's a metaphor for falling in love with other nations who they believe will protect them.
Yeah.
Economically, militarily, politically, in every way. And once again, every decision they have made is putting their trust in something other than God.
Yeah, this theme that happens in so many of the prophetic texts, including Hosea, I think sometimes surprises the modern reader. We're pretty used to thinking of geopolitics as a game of political strategy, of allies and whatever. And they were used to that too. Except the prophets kept showing up and saying, that isn't how God wants you. Your security is not because you've cut a deal with Assyria or cut a deal with Egypt, or as they often were trying to do, play Assyria and Egypt against each other. No, your security, that's always going to backfire, the prophets kept saying. Your security comes in trusting in God. That's how the nation will be secure. You're not trying to work world politics. And so this is a spiritual affront every time they cut some deal. Yep. And of course, if you read the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, you can see the deal's always backfired.
They do.
Yeah.
They do.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how each of these layers of offense overlaps, because running off to get political protection or military protection from some other nation puts you in touch with their idolatrous worship.
Yes.
And when you adopt that idolatrous worship, then you find yourself living in compromised ethical and moral ways. Right. So they
all interact.
They're not just side by side by side. They're all stacked up and related to one another.
Because we cut a deal with Assyria, we're going to put a statue up to one of Assyria's gods, which compromises our worship of the one true God, which means we're going to start acting like the Assyrians act ethically. Yeah, what a layered thing. All right, we get more religious charges, which are in some sense repetitious, but it is one of my favorite sentences in Hosea, is Hosea 8:11, which different translations render it differently, but I actually checked. In almost every translation, the coolness of the sentence is maintained. Okay. You built altars to take away sin. They have become altars where you sin. Your NIV says, you built offerings for sin offerings. They have become altars for sinning. Wow. What an indictment that the very religious practices you developed to take away your sin are in fact the religious practices that lead you deeper and deeper into sin.
And all of this gets summarized in verse 14 in a very powerful sentence. Israel has forgotten its maker. So there's its rejection of...
Where what they said, though, oh God, we acknowledge you. And he's like, actually, no. You've forgotten.
You forgot me. You built palaces. So there's putting your trust in your local government, right? And there's a mention of Judah. Judah is not guilt-free here, even though Hosea is mainly focused on Israel.
Right.
But I will send fire upon his cities. I will devour his strongholds. So here's the combination of religious, economic, military, and political sin all piled up and summarized in verse 14.
And we get a hint of the sentence, the judgment. I'm going to destroy some stuff. And we've already seen, of course, hints in this trial narrative starting in chapter 4. Hosea has begun to point in clearer and clearer language of a coming destruction for the northern kingdom. And in today's text, in chapter 10, it gets very, very clear.
Yeah.
And it's worth reminding, if you don't remember the history, this destruction happens. The destruction that, even though Hosea is in some sense, well, in many senses, it's a book full of hope, as we'll see even today. There's always a word of hope. Hosea can never say anything bad without reminding us where the hope is. It also is a book that says there is punishment coming, and that punishment, in fact, in history does come.
Yeah. And to put this in historical context, it's helpful to remember that Hosea is prophesying right in the middle of the 8th century. That's the 700s. So right around 750 BC. 722 is when Assyria came in, invaded for the third time, and destroyed the northern kingdom. So, in other words, we're within one generation of the fulfillment of these warnings.
So this terrible sentence, I will send fire in their cities, I will consume their fortresses, that is going to happen within the lifetime of most of the people hearing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, when we get to chapter 9, we're going to get another section that lists the charges, the wrongdoings of Israel that has put them under indictment. I don't know that we need to talk them through in great detail because they are pretty repetitious. They mention idolatry. By the way, in verse 1 of chapter 9, where it says, you have prostituted yourself, I'm pretty sure that that's the metaphorical use, don't you think?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Of finding lovers in other countries, other nations, not
especially this reference to the threshing floor, which reminds us of that the particular appeal of the Baal cult was its fertility.
Yes,
that it's going to make your crops grow.
Right.
Yeah. The other thing I think is worth noticing. Well, again, you're right. Most of these indictments these charges aren't new. There is a little bit of, there's some new details that I think, remind us. And there's this beginning of the hint that their very attempts to magnify their fertility, their productivity, are in fact going to backfire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's when we get to the sentence in just a second.
Yeah.
That is clearly the point. I did want to take a quick peek at chapter 9, verse 13, which again kind of sums up all the wrongdoing of the northern kingdom. You have plowed wickedness, so there's the moral or ethical wrongdoing. You have reaped injustice. That is the mistreatment, the economic mistreatment of the poor and the vulnerable. You have eaten the fruit of lies, that's moral again, because you have trusted in chariots and warriors. And there's the political intrigue, putting their trust in other nations and political systems and armies. So that, again, he's repeating and summing up all the offenses.
Right.
Now, you had
Just
mentioned...
for clarity, you called that 9:13. That's 10:13.
Thank you.
But it still does. It has exactly the effect you just described. Everything you said was true, except for those following along at home.
That's good.
That's 10:13.
Everybody's
flipping through.
What verse
I must
is he
confess,
talking about?
even I was flipping through just a little bit. I was like, I'm pretty sure that's not 9:13. 10:13.
You
All
found
right,
it.
great.
Chapter
Okay,
10,
good.
verse 8. Okay, now you had mentioned the irony of thinking that if they worship this fertility cult god, Baal and Asherah and the other gods, that this would bring agricultural benefit, lots of healthy kids.
Right.
And you say that is going to backfire in a major way.
Right. I mean, it just says every time you turn around, the food you grow, you're not going to get to eat it. Even when you do grow, you won't get to eat. That's in 9 verse 4. And you won't grow as much as you think. Yeah.
Verse 2 says, the threshing floor and wine vat shall not feed them.
Yeah.
Instead of having a big wheat crop and a big bunch of grapes coming in, no, they're going to be left empty-handed.
Yeah.
So this is all going to backfire. The other thing that's going to backfire on them is these alliances with Egypt and Assyria.
Right. Yeah.
And that's brought out in verse 6. And we are in chapter 9.
We are in chapter 9, verse 6. I'll double check. You read it. We'll see what happens.
All right. I think it's chapter 9, verse 6. For even if they escape destruction, Egypt will gather them.
Yeah.
Memphis shall bury them.
Right.
I don't think that's that big city in the western part of Tennessee.
I think that is not. I think although there is a pyramid there now. It's a
true.
Bass Pro Shop, I believe. Yeah. Yeah.
Memphis was a great, big, powerful city in Egypt.
Yeah.
And so the point there that we're illustrating is that their worship of Baal is going to backfire on them agriculturally, and they're looking for military and political protection from Egypt is going to backfire. In fact, Egypt will just capture them instead of protect them.
Yeah.
Good.
The interesting thing for me about all this sets up a little pattern that emerges. Let's talk about that just a little bit, kind of as we build to a climax of this, of the charges and the sentencing. Talk about that pattern that emerges.
Yeah, we see it in chapter 9 and in chapter 10. Let me illustrate it in chapter 9, starting in verse 10. Like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel. So Hosea starts out with an image of fertility, saying, God has planted Israel, and it's supposed to be a flourishing vine, yielding grapes. Even though it's in the wilderness, God is going to tend it and protect it, and it'll still bear good grapes. But then Hosea says a big but they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to a thing of shame. That's a reminder that the Israelites went over into Moab, crossed the Jordan River, and started marrying into the Moabite people and adopting their fertility.
It's the same thing.
Worship.
It's a treaty leads to idolatry, which leads to moral compromise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so he says, I tried to plant you and bring about harvest from you, but you turned against me. And then the third section of the pattern is a therefore. Therefore, verse 11 says, Ephraim's glory will fly away like a bird, no birth, no pregnancy, no conception. Even if they bring up children, they'll die. In other words, the point you were making earlier about all of this hope for fertility, is just going to be totally backfired.
God says, I made it fertile. Mm-hmm. You rebelled by chasing fertility gods, ironically.
Yeah.
And so I will make it unfertile.
Yeah. So this pattern, it gets repeated through the rest of chapter 9 and all the way through chapter 10. Maybe we could jump to the last repetition of the pattern. Is that a good idea?
Should we warn our readers? This one's tough. This one's hard. But go ahead. Yeah,
this
jump
one
in.
hurts. And this is right near the end of the book.
Right near the end.
Right at the end of the book. So we're now over in chapter 10, and we're going to again be introduced to an image of fertility. Ephraim was a trained heifer that loved to thresh.
This is verse 11.
Verse 11.
Yeah.
So Ephraim, as we mentioned earlier, is another way of talking about the northern kingdom, Israel.
Right.
Ephraim was the largest and most significant tribal group in the northern kingdom.
Just a reminder, so for those of you that are joining us that haven't heard us talk through this again, Hosea will use a couplet. Well, he'll say, Ephraim did this, Israel did this. That's the same people he's talking about. He's just using two names. He does it in verse 6. Ephraim will be disgraced, Israel will be ashamed. That's the same place, the same people, the same thing. It's these double couplets, double names. Prophets love that. But Ephraim and Israel, same place, same people.
And we actually skipped over two others. Sometimes he calls them Jacob.
Right.
Because Jacob was the original name of the man, Israel.
Yes.
And sometimes he uses the term Samaria.
That's the capital.
That was the capital.
Yes.
Yeah.
And all those words, in fact, that couplet in in 6, I could have gone to 7. Ephraim will disgrace, Israel will be ashamed, Samaria will be destroyed. All the same place, all the same thing.
Very good.
Right. Okay,
all right.
But you were down in verse 11.
We're talking about
Ephraim
this thrifold pattern.
Is a trained heifer, loves to thresh.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's a good thing.
Yes.
A really nice young cow, which is well-trained and obedient and is being very productive for God, threshing out the grain. So that's all good. Mm-hmm. And God is providing fertility. But it goes on to say, I will make Ephraim break the ground, Judah must plow, Jacob must harrow for himself. You have plowed wickedness. In other words, all of this fertility has turned to infertility because you tried worshiping gods of fertility.
Yeah.
And worse than that, trusted in your chariots, multiplied your warriors. So we've seen that language before.
Yeah.
Therefore, what's going to happen?
Yeah. So we're going to come back to verse 12. I just want to make sure if you're following along, you're like, they skipped verse 12 on purpose. Therefore, and this is another one of these places where Hosea just a little bit, slips out of the metaphor just a little bit to be really clear on the judgment that is in fact being predicted here. Verse 14, this is brutal. This is sort of the end of the trial sequence. So we said from 4 to 10, we're at the end of the trial. You may have wondered, what would the outcome of the trial be? This is sort of the outcome of the trial, barring the one verse we've left out that we're going to go back with. But the outcome of the trial is this: the roar of the battle will rise against your people, so that all your fortresses will be destroyed. As Shalman devastated Beth Arbel on the days of battle when mothers were dashed to the ground with their children, so will it happen to you, Bethel, because your wickedness is great. When that day dawns, the king of Israel will be completely destroyed. And like we said earlier, this is somewhere around 750-ish, maybe a little later by now. And that's exactly what's going to happen in 722.
In other words, the sentence in this trial is guilty.
Guilty.
And they're being punished.
Yeah.
And it's for real punishment. They're being held accountable for their idolatry and lack of trust in God. But even with a guilty verdict and even with an assignment of punishment, there is still the possibility of clemency.
Absolutely. And we've talked about this when we were talking about the marriage metaphor, that there is punishment, there was unfaithfulness, it has to be dealt with, the marriage has to be restored. But Hosea never talks about God's judgment or punishment in ways that are final. Hosea always reminds us that God can redeem even out of punishment. That's verse 12 that we skipped. Hosea will, even this late in the trial, he won't give up. Sow righteousness for yourselves and reap the fruit of unfailing love. Break up the unplowed ground. Get ready, for it's time to seek the Lord until he comes and showers his righteousness on you. This is chapter 10, verse 12. Yeah.
And the language is so beautiful and so deliberate. all of this language is the language of agricultural fertility.
Yeah.
So as S-O-W, right?
Yep,
Not
right.
S-E-W. Yes. So he says there's going to be a great planting of seed, spiritual seed, that's going to lead to righteousness, which means a realignment of Israel's commitment to God. And then the verb becomes reaping, and this time the fruit that they reap is this beautiful term that we saw back in Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. Right. Your translation says faithful love.
Unfailing love.
Unfailing love. Mm-hmm. Steadfast love is another one. It's that Hebrew word hesed,
right,
which implies God's covenant love based on God's own loyalty and faithfulness and what he expects his covenant people to reciprocate to him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we've talked about this a couple of times in Hosea. Hosea is a prophet who must necessarily prophesy the punishment of God because he identifies the rebelliousness of God's people. And they were a covenant people. And we could go back and do a long study on Deuteronomy. The covenant says if you do this, you'll prosper. And if you rebel, there's discipline attached to that. And so Hosea, as a faithful speaker of God's character and God's truth, has to lay out the charges and identify the coming sentence. And because he's a faithful speaker of God's truth, that means he also is going to remind them that the same judge that identifies the charges, the same judge that executes the sentence, is also the judge that offers clemency to those who turn to him. Mm-hmm. And of course, that part of the prophecy also comes true. We think of the other prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah, who live and do their ministry after the destruction of the northern kingdom. They keep saying what Hosea says. Oh yeah, God's not done. God hasn't given up. Mm-hmm. God has redemption coming. And so I love that Hosea, because he represents the character of God, is unable to even go a whole chapter of just destruction. Mm. He has to stop and remind us, oh yeah, God has a clemency strategy. Return to God. Mm. Let him plant some righteous seed. Let him break up the ground. Let him bring rain. Yeah.
So the mercy of God depends not only on what God is prepared to do in spite of their sin, but it's also an invitation, or maybe I should say a challenge, for Israel to respond. And that's why this beautiful verse 12 says, it's time to seek the Lord.
Time to seek the Lord. Yeah. Okay, that's a pretty good place for us to stop. We've worked through the first two big metaphors, the marriage metaphor and the trial metaphor. Next week in chapter 11, we get a new one, the metaphor of the loving parent and the, unfortunately, disobedient child, as a new way of thinking and learning about the character of God and God's love through the prophet Hosea. But for today, it's a pretty good place to stop, to remember that all of us would do well to return and seek the Lord, that he may plant righteousness in us. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.